So in my previous video tutorial, we already talked about how every resident assigned with ID and how to add resident. And now, in this part 3, let's talk about how to edit data or the resident name. So first, let's put a comment, hashtag, and categorize this as editing or updating residency. Editing or updating residency. Then next, let's use LF statement. LF choice is equal to 2 semicolon and print next line edit or update residency. So this or update residency will display on our program. In the next line, we're gonna initialize our variable residence is equal to 1001. Then next is end search is equal to false. Let's make our end search temporarily to is equal to false. Then input residency ID. Input residency ID is equal to int, which is integer, and input for the user to input and display this residency ID. So the user will input the residency ID. Then we're gonna use a while loop statement. While end search copy then paste is equal to false, which is true because we initialize here our end search to false, which is true. So the inside of this while block will execute this try. We already discussed what is try and its function. You can watch it in my part 1. So the inside of this try block is read file is equal to open string because we use a multiple character. Then the inside of the file is the residency ID plus open quote dot JSON close quote comma then open quote again R to read the file then close parenthesis. And if residency ID is equal to input residence, this input residency ID, if the user will input a correct and existed ID, the if statement will become true. Then the end search is equal now to true. Then else residency ID is equal to residency ID plus 1. Then we are also use except file not found error. The inside of this except is end search is equal to true. Then residency ID is equal to 0. Here in residency ID is equal to 0, we need to make it to 0 for if the user will input a wrong or not existed ID resident will display error message. Then the next is if residency ID is equal to 0, then now it will display print display file not found. So if the user will input an ID that is not existing and resident ID that is not a resident in Barangay 62A or not a resident in Barangay 62A. Then next line or else, and now if the user will input exact and existing ID and a resident of Barangay 62A, that's now the program will go through this. Resident data is equal to JSON dot loads read file dot read. Our variable resident data is assigned to accept data object because we use JSON dot loads. Then the inside of this else is if statement. If string resident data inside, which is the opened file, which has a resident name. Resident name is not equal to deleted, then semicolon. That's all. The next line is print residency ID plus string resident data inside is residency ID. Then same on the next line, it is print the resident name plus string resident data and the inside of the resident data, which is resident name. Then input residency ID is equal to string resident data. The inside is residency ID. Then we're going to close the file. Read file dot close. So this will only read the file and have a task to display it. And now the editing data will go through this. We have a variable inter resident. Intel resident is equal to input. The user will input and display inter updated resident. So here our variable inter resident will the user will input the updated resident. Then next is edit resident JSON is equal to residency ID semicolon then residency ID and comma. Next is resident name. Then our variable now of resident name is the new updated resident, then close parenthesis. Next is a variable of resident data string is equal to JSON dot dumps. Then the inside of this JSON dot dumps is the edit resident JSON. So we use dumps because which is convert the Python object into appropriate JSON file. The next is create file is equal to open string input resident ID. Input residency ID. Copy and paste, close and plus JSON comma W to write our new updated resident, then close parenthesis. This statement to open the file with a name file of ID, the input residency ID, and create file dot write. Then the inside of this is our resident data string, the converted Python object into appropriate JSON file. Then the create file now will to be closed. Then next line is print now our resident name is now equal to our new updated resident. Enter resident, then comma. Next are the residency ID. Our residency ID will still the same. So the only updated is our resident name. Then we put next in the next line to print or to display to our program na has been updated. Let's put a little design. So in this create that file, we'll write the converted appropriate JSON object, and create file will now be closed. Then we'll display this resident name and the residency ID. The resident name updated resident name. So now let's try our program. So we choose number 2, edit or update residency. It's enter to, then edit or update residency. Enter residency ID. So we only stored one data. So let's put the residency ID of 0001. So we're gonna put now enter updated resident, a new name. Let's say Juan de la Cruz. Then enter. So now resident name Juan de la Cruz, residency ID has been updated. So our program was working. Let's go back to our program. Then what if he or she is a resident of the said barangay but his or her file is not existing anymore? Then we're gonna put else print resident resident info was already deleted. Next line. This will be discussed in my next video tutorial on how to delete a data. And that's all for now. Thank you for watching.